I still remember those mist-veiled mornings in the aftermath of the Norman conquest, when London itself seemed to shudder beneath the weight of change. And it was during those uncertain days that William, our newly crowned conqueror, made a decision that would alter not just the skyline, but the very soul of England. In 1078, by his command, construction began upon what would one day stand as one of the most formidable fortresses in history, the Tower of London. And how it rose, its stones laid upon stones, a symbol of power and an unspoken threat cast both for protection and for domination, a constant reminder to the conquered Anglo-Saxons of the might of their new Norman rulers. I recall well the grumblings of the people, how the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recorded their anger and dismay. In this year, 1078, the king built the great tower at London, and many shires which owed works of service were greatly oppressed in the making of the castle. Indeed, it was no simple structure. The White Tower, as we would soon come to call its soaring keep, rose from the earth, like a declaration, thick walls of Kentish ragstone and cairnstone from Normandy itself rising to heights of 90 feet, with a base 15 feet thick, an edifice impossible to ignore, and designed to withstand any siege or assault. And there, amidst the scaffolds and clamor, was Gundulf, Bishop of Rochester, the builder. Bishop, they called him. Guiding this monumental work with an architect's eye and a warrior's foresight. I remember watching as he oversaw the addition of innovative defenses, a four-building entrance reached only by wooden stairs, which could be torn down in moments should enemies breach the outer walls. Within, he commissioned a chapel, the Chapel of St. John, which still to this day remains one of the finest expressions of Norman architecture in all of England. Round arches, mighty columns, and a sense of sanctity amid stone. But the tower, as you will come to know, was never meant to remain unchanged. Monarch after monarch added their touch, their vanity, their pride, their fear. I remember how Richard the Lionheart in 1190, between crusades, ordered the digging of a broad moat, a belt of water meant to isolate this mighty heart of power, and how King John, treacherous and cunning, thickened the walls and strengthened the gates with iron and stone. Yet it was Henry III, that restless builder king, who truly transformed this place, reshaping it, not merely as a fortress, but as a residence fit for royalty. How the Wakefield Tower and Lanthorn Tower rose under his order, draped inside with painted roses and garlands, fine silks on the walls, colored glass in the windows. I once glimpsed the Queen's chamber myself, as craftsmen laid delicate designs of winter branches and summer blooms across the painted plaster. And the tower was alive then not merely with guards and masons, but with creatures of wonder, for the royal menagerie had begun to take shape. I still remember the day they brought the polar bear a gift from the King of Norway, no less its heavy body pacing the courtyard, its chain clinking as keepers led it down to the Thames to fish its supper from the river's cold depths. And how Londoners crowded the banks to see such a marvel, a fortress, a palace, a zoo already. The Tower of London was becoming many things at once, a place of marvels and of dread, destined to wear many faces through the centuries that followed. I must confess there was always a strange enchantment in those years, when the tower served not only as fortress and prison, but also as the seat of royal splendor. By the time Henry III had transformed the upper chambers with paintings of roses and embroidered hangings, the tower no longer felt solely a place of grim purpose. It had become a royal house in its own right. And oh, how alive it was with courtiers and craftsmen, guards and beasts alike. I remember the stir when the royal menagerie grew. Word had spread through London that new marvels were arriving, exotic creatures sent from foreign monarchs, eager to curry favor with England's king. The sight that most astonished me was the great polar bear, that mighty creature from the cold northern seas. The bear would be led on a long chain through the lower gate, escorted down to the Thames, where, to the amazement of the gathered crowds, It would dive into the dark waters to catch its fish. To think a bear fishing in our river, children would gape and cheer, while merchants whispered tales of distant kingdoms. And then there were the crown jewels, riches beyond mortal reckoning. I have seen them gleam in torchlight, locked away beneath watchful eyes. How the very air seemed heavier in their presence. The Cullinan diamond before it was cut weighed over 3,000 carats, the largest gem ever unearthed by man. I could scarcely believe such a stone existed, and the imperial state crown encrusted with thousands of diamonds and rare gems, each more precious than the last. It was a treasure hoard fit to tempt the devil himself. I recall well the daring theft that nearly was. In 1671, a bold rogue named Colonel Blood, disguised as a humble clergyman, slipped past the Tower guards and nearly seized the very crown of England. But fate intervened, and when caught, Blood, with a rogue's charm, told King Charles himself I would have added England's crown to my achievements. And in a turn stranger than fiction, the king pardoned him and granted lands worth £500 a year. Such are the strange twists of fortune in this place. But the Tower was never just a showpiece. It was the very mint of England, the place where our coinage, the silver pennies that drove commerce through all the shires, was struck. I remember the ringing of the hammers, the smell of molten metal. In 1279 alone, they minted over 4 million coins, enough to flood the markets of London and beyond. Without the Tower's mint, the kingdom's very economy would have faltered. And when Elizabeth came to the throne, the Tower's royal armories grew vast. I myself have seen row upon row of gleaming pikes and swords, enough to arm 15,000 men at a moment's call. There was one armorer in particular, Jacob Holder, whose craftwork was the stuff of legend. He fashioned parade armors so intricate, chased with silver, engraved with scenes of glory, that even the Queen herself would stop to admire them. One set he made for Sir James Scudamore cost a fortune, enough to purchase a fine estate. Such was the Tower then, a place of splendor, of strength, of marvels and coin, a heart beating at the center of England's power. Yet beneath the glittering surface, darker shadows already gathered, for the Tower's story was destined to grow darker still. Ah, but how quickly fortunes can turn within these walls. For though the Tower had once echoed with the chatter of courtiers and the clang of armorers, over time, its character shifted slowly but surely towards something darker, more fearful. I watched it happen as kings grew wary, as power bred suspicion, as intrigue and rebellion left their bitter traces behind. And so the Tower, which had been a royal seat, began to grow into a prison of state, its stones remembering every footfall, every locked door, every whispered plea for mercy. The first prisoner of whom I ever heard tale was Ranulph Flambard, Bishop of Durham. That bold churchman had offended King Henry I, and so was clapped in the Tower in 1101. But Flambard was no ordinary captive. I still smile to think of it, how he charmed his guards, with a grand feast lured them into drunken revelry, and then under cover of night escaped down a rope smuggled in a barrel of wine. That little adventure spurred the Crown to reinforce the Tower's security iron bars on the windows, more vigilant watchmen at the gates. Yet prisoners kept coming. Through the centuries, I saw noble heads bowed as they passed beneath the arch of Traitor's Gate. One that haunts my memory still is Charles, Duke of Orleans, a poet captive from Agincourt, locked away here for 25 long years. From his cell he penned verses that sang of longing and despair. Go forth, my song made in my tower of pain, to meet my lady, tell her I'm alive. Such words could soften even a jailer's heart. By the time the Wars of the Roses swept through England, the Tower had become ever more tightly bound to the specter of imprisonment and execution. It seemed that each fresh wave of nobles brought their enemies here in chains. I remember the Salt Tower, once a proud battlement, now infamous for housing supposed witches. and the Beauchamp Tower, where I would run my fingers across the ancient stone and feel the names and pleas carved by desperate hands. One mark in particular grieved me, a simple Jane etched deep into the wall. It was said her husband, Lord Guildford Dudley, carved it in grief before both he and Lady Jane Grey met their end. The very stones remember. Another time I read the Latin script of Philip Howard Quanto, plus Afflictiones pro Christo, in hoc saeculo tanto, plus gloriae cum Christo in futuro. The more affliction we endure for Christ in this world, the more glory we shall obtain with Christ in the next. Such faith even in the shadow of the axe, and still the tower's fame or infamy grew. By the time of the Peasants' Revolt in 1381, I watched King Richard II himself take refuge here, a mere boy, amid the rage of the mob. I stood upon the walls as smoke rose over London, the city below in chaos, but the tower held firm. Strong, stone-deep moat loyal guards, it was as ever the last refuge of kings in their hour of need. But with each passing year, fewer came here to dine in splendor, and more arrived in chains. The Tower of London. My tower had begun to earn its darker reputation. I saw the tower stand through many storms of England's making, and none tested its stones more sorely than the great upheavals of rebellion and civil war. I was there upon these ancient walls when history itself seemed to tremble beneath our feet. I remember well the summer of 1381, the Peasants' Revolt. London burned with fury. The Commons had risen, and their wrath knew no bounds. But within the tower, young King Richard II took refuge, the weight of his crown heavy upon his brow. I stood upon the battlements as angry crowds surged across London Bridge, their shouts echoing from St. Paul's to the very walls where I kept my watch. Yet the tower endured. Strong and silent it held against the storm, a sanctuary of royal power, while rebellion raged beyond the moat. And so it was again and again in the centuries that followed. The tower's role as a fortress grew ever more vital as England fractured. When civil war tore the realm asunder, and Parliament stood against the king, the tower's ancient stones once more bristled with arms and men. I was there in 1642 when Parliament's forces, grim-faced and resolute, seized the tower. Our commander then was Sir John Byron, Constable of the Tower, an honorable man, but wise enough to know that resistance was folly. He surrendered without a fight. I remember standing beside the great gate as Sir William Balfour, Lieutenant General of the Ordnance, took command. His men brought forth their lists, a grim inventory. 15,000 small arms stacked within these halls, 200 barrels of gunpowder, great bronze cannon lining the walls. The air was thick with the scent of saltpeter and oil. The silence broken only by the clink of musket parts and whispered orders. And yet, even as we watched the banners of Parliament fly above the tower, I could not help but grieve. For this place, once sacred to the crown, had become a prize of civil strife. The poet John Denham put it well in those dark days, that sacred place where fortune's favors fell, sacred no more but house of treason's smell. Time marched on, but the tower's military role never truly faded. I lived long enough to witness the terrible years of the Second World War. A new kind of war with machines of steel and skies aflame. London suffered beneath the Blitz of 1941, and even here, even these walls of ancient stone could not escape the bombs. I shall never forget the night of September 5th, when a high explosive blast shook the north battlements and shattered windows in the Crown Jewels chamber. Dust and smoke choked the air, yet still the tower stood, and so it endures. Through centuries of siege and fire of rebellion and war, this place has remained a steadfast symbol of England's heart. The Tower of London, battered but unbroken, holds its place, a silent sentinel of all we have been and all we yet may be. I have walked these stones so long that I can scarcely tell where the past ends and the present begins, for even in the modern age, the tower has remained a place where shadows gather and secrets cling to every wall. Though the kings no longer reside here, and the great lords of old have long since faded from these halls, prisoners have never truly stopped coming, nor has the tower forgotten its darker purpose. I remember when Rudolf Hess himself, Hitler's deputy, was brought here in chains in 1941. Imagine that, the high-ranking architect of the Nazi regime now pacing beneath these ancient arches, where so many had walked before him. His stay was brief, for the army soon took him away to more fitting confinement. Yet for those days, the tower once again knew the weight of a prisoner whose name would be written in history. But perhaps more chilling were those final executions. Yes, even into the 20th century, the tower's soil was not yet done drinking blood. 12 German spies met their end here during the Great War. I remember the last one most clearly, Joseph Jacobs, executed on the 15th of August, 1941. A firing squad, a small rifle range tucked away in the tower's depths. The echoes of those shots linger still in my ears. And with him ended the long, grim tradition of executions within these walls. Yet amid all the cruelty and death, not every prisoner suffered equally. I have seen the old records, the tower bills of the 16th century, and they tell their own curious stories. High-born captives, you see, were granted certain privileges should fortune favor them. Servants were allowed rich foods could be brought. Even walks in the garden were permitted, though, under ever-watchful eyes. I recall how Elizabeth, the Princess Elizabeth, later to be queen, was held here in 1554. Though a prisoner, she was still of royal blood. They let her walk beneath the tower's sky, always guarded, her every step observed. And Sir Walter Raleigh, how often I wandered past his quarters, where strange scents of herbs and tinctures would drift into the halls. He spent 13 long years here conducting alchemical experiments in his still room and brewing that great cordial medicine for which he became famed. I remember hearing that his own son had been born within these walls, and they called him Carew after the tower itself. And Raleigh, for all his genius, still wrestled with his conscience in the silence of his cell. I have read his words scratched upon old parchment. Who knows not conscience is born of love. Then if I were to name the general cause, I should say love is the cause of conscience. Such musings echo through the stone long after the man himself was gone. The tower may stand silent now, its gates open to tourists rather than traitors, yet beneath the footsteps of the curious, the old lives still whisper. For in this place, the line between prisoner and prince, between scholar and spy, has always been perilously thin. Ah, but if you would truly know the tower, not just its stones and iron, its kings and traitors, then you must know its ravens. For I tell you, no tale of this place is complete without them. I have walked these courtyards beneath gray skies and starlit nights, and always, always the ravens were there, black-winged sentinels watching over the ancient walls, their dark eyes gleaming with something deeper than mere hunger. They say the legend began in the reign of Charles II. I heard it told many times the king's own astronomer John Flamsteed complained that the birds interfered with his instruments, and so Charles, perhaps amused, perhaps half fearing the old superstitions, declared that 6 ravens must ever be kept at the tower. For if they were to leave so, the prophecy warned the kingdom itself would fall. And so it has been from that day to this. I have seen them 7 birds now, for prudence keeps an extra one always on hand, each with clipped wings to ensure their presence remains. But do not mistake them for mere prisoners. Each raven has its name, its place, its fierce personality. Some clever, some haughty, some solemn as any jailer. There was one in my time whom none who met him could forget, old Jim Crow. For 44 years he served the tower, outliving many a constable and warder. I saw him often strutting across the green bowing and curtsying to the astonished visitors. And those who scoffed at tales of fate and magic soon grew quiet when Jim fixed them with his black gaze. I have always believed that the ravens know more than they let on. They have seen centuries pass, kings rise and fall, blood stain the stones and moss grow over forgotten names. They have outlasted traitors and sovereigns alike. And long after I am gone, I know they will remain guardians of a tower where time itself stands still. Of all the souls who served within these walls, kings, queens, jailers, guards, none bore a heavier burden than those few who were known as the executioners of the tower. I knew of them well, those men whose duty it was to end the lives of others, whose names became whispered with dread in the streets of London. In their grim art, they stood apart from all others, not quite soldiers, not quite servants, but bound to the tower by blood and steel. I recall Richard Brandon, infamous in his day, the king's executioner in the mid-17th century. It was he, they say, who struck the fatal blow to King Charles I. For £30, an unheard-of sum in those days, and the king's own cloak, Brandon performed the deed, though in later years he would confess that the king's ghost haunted his dreams. On his deathbed, they say he whispered, "The ghost of the king haunts my dreams." But the life of an executioner was never easy, no matter the coin. Even in Tudor times, the records show I have seen them. They earned £23 a year, with extra fees for each death. 13 shillings and 4 pence for a beheading. 6 shillings and 8 pence for a hanging. A grim accounting of life and death. And yet these men were shunned, feared, loathed, sometimes pitied. John Ketch, a name that still lives in legend, as Jack Ketch was perhaps the most notorious. A man so clumsy in his craft that he became a figure of mockery in puppet shows and ballads. I have read in Samuel Pepys's diary how Ketch, vain of his own grim fame, even had his name painted in gold above his door at the Lamb and Flag Tavern, where he drank alone, despised by all. And the tools of their trade, what grim instruments they were. I have seen the executioner's axe myself, a monstrous thing, near 7 pounds in weight, its great blade 18 inches long. It took great strength and skill to wield such a weapon cleanly. And yet for those of noble rank, a sword was used instead, a more honorable death, if such a thing can be said of dying. I remember how Henry VIII sent to Calais for the famed swordsman Jean Rambaud to ensure that Anne Boleyn's death would be swift. No expense was spared, £23,000 in today's coin, to purchase that single moment of mercy. Rambaud's technique was legend, a quick distraction, a whispered word, so the condemned might look away just as the blade fell. They say Anne's lips were still moving in prayer when her head struck the straw. And oh, the scaffold, a grim theater raised high so all might see. 15 feet above the ground, it stood built from planks and nails, the block itself fashioned from solid oak, its curve worn smooth by so many necks. I remember how they would clean it carefully, sometimes laying fresh straw to soak the blood. The executioners themselves, strange men, driven by fate or desperation to their grim calling. Some drank deeply the night before to steady trembling hands. Others whispered prayers over their axe. There was Francis Threadkill, who slept with his blade beneath his pillow and prayed, "Grant me strength to serve justice with mercy." Yet for all their rituals and bravado, the toll of this work was great. Many fell into madness or despair. Thomas Derrick, once a condemned man pardoned to become an executioner, wrote in his diary, "Each night I see their faces noble and common alike in the moment before the blade falls." And Edward Dennis, after the beheading of the Earl of Essex, grew so ill with sorrow that he begged leave of his duties, retreating into prayer and the solace of his small herb garden. I tell you this beneath the black mask. The executioner was no monster, but a man burdened with a task, that no heart could long endure. Ah, but not all executions went as planned. No matter the rituals, no matter the skill of the blade, fate has a cruel way of turning such moments awry. And I have seen more times than I would wish how a single trembling hand or a twist of fear could turn a solemn execution into a scene of horror. I remember, how could I forget the dreadful day in 1541, when Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, met her fate upon the scaffold. She was 67 years old, proud and unyielding even then. When the time came, she refused to kneel, refused to place her head upon the block. Chaos followed the young, inexperienced executioner, chasing her across the scaffold, striking wildly. 11 blows it took before death came. I can still hear the gasps and cries from the horrified crowd. The man's name was Alexander Burwell. I read it later in the Tower records. The poor soul was so broken by what he had done that he fled, vanishing into a monastery far from London, hoping to find peace for the stain upon his spirit. And it was not the last such tragedy. In 1645, Sir Alexander Carew was beheaded, or rather half-beheaded, for the executioner, Ralph Griffin, failed in his first stroke, and the crowd grew restless, near to riot. The guards had to escort him away under arms to keep him from the mob's fury. There is a bitter truth in these moments, for when death's dark servant trembles at his task, as the poet John Taylor wrote, it is the condemned who must wear the executioner's mask. Yet there was one mercy that could alter even the darkest hour, the royal pardon. I have seen it with my own eyes, messengers galloping through London papers, clutched in trembling hands, arriving at the scaffold in the very breath before the axe could fall. In 1483, Sir James Tyrrell had already knelt at the block when the king's messenger arrived too late by moments. The shock was so great that they say his hair turned white that very day. And bitter irony it was, for years later, Tyrrell returned to this tower once more, this time without hope of reprieve, accused of murdering the lost princes in the tower. Another time, 1553, I watched John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, mount the scaffold. A murmur passed through the crowd as a royal message was delivered. But it was no pardon, only a delay so that Dudley might first witness the execution of his fellow conspirator. I heard his bitter words that day, "This day's delay is but to taste the bitterness of death twice over." Such scenes were cruel theater. For in the Tower, the line between death and life was always perilously thin, held fast by fate and the will of the crown. And we who served beneath these stones could only watch helpless as destiny played out its grim design. There is much the world does not know. Of executioners, their ways, their rituals, the strange and solemn duties that fell to them beyond the moment of death. I have watched them at their work. I have seen their preparations, their private rites performed in the shadowed chambers of the Tower. And I can tell you they were men of routine and superstition, for how else could one bear such a life? Before each execution, it was custom for the executioner to fast an empty belly, making for a steadier hand, they said. And always without fail, they would ask forgiveness from their doomed charge. I have heard it myself. "Forgive me this duty, sir. It is not mine by will, but by office." And when the scaffold was cleared, the axe and block would be veiled in black cloth, for death itself demanded respect. I remember the inventory's old pages inked with care. In 1597, a full account of the tools was written, axes, swords, blocks each with its own history. The edge must be honed with finest stone and oiled with whale fat to ensure cleanest severance. Those were the words. William Rosewarden, a master of the axe, kept such records during his years of service. I once read his handbook. He would store his blades in salt-packed leather to stave off rust, and practice his swing on pumpkins, filled with red wine to mimic the resistance of flesh. And what of their dress? You may think the black mask was worn to hide the face, but no. It was a symbol of death's impartiality, of the gravity of the act. They wore black or dark gray garments, leather aprons to guard against the spray of blood. On solemn occasions, royal executions, great lords condemned they would don a hood of velvet. I have seen the account of Thomas Howard, 2 leather masks at 4 shillings each, a velvet hood for 15 boots of Spanish leather. And when death had done its work, the executioner's duty did not end. They were charged with clearing the body and belongings, and here lay another old custom. Rings and jewels must be returned to the family eye, but clothing and personal effects, these belonged to the executioner by right. Thus it was that condemned men often came to die in rags, though they had lived in silk, for none wished to enrich the hand that struck their head from their shoulders. I read the words of Sir Thomas Wilson, a lieutenant of the Tower. They come to die in rags, though they lived in silk, for none wished to enrich the man who takes their life. And so it was grim custom upon grim custom, the ancient rites of death carried out in the Tower's shadowed heart. A solemn theater bound by law, by tradition, by the unspoken weight of so many lives ended within these walls. If these stones could speak the tales, they would tell of legends who met their fate upon Tower Green or beneath the looming scaffold of Tower Hill. I have stood in those places where the ground remembers, where the air still hums with the weight of final moments. And though I have seen many pass through these gates in life and in chains, there are some whose deaths have echoed through the centuries. I often think first of Anne Boleyn, poor proud Anne, whose fate drew eyes from all of Europe. It was May of 1536. I remember her final days well imprisoned in the Queen's House Room 15. They said she wept and laughed in turns, her spirit flitting between despair and a strange composure. Sir William Kingston, the Tower's constable, reported every detail to Cromwell. I still recall her dark jest. I hear say, "The executioner is very good, and I have but a little neck." And so saying, she wrapped her hands around her slender throat and laughed. Even her enemies could not deny her courage. A swordsman was summoned from Calais. Jean Rambaud, famed for his swift, clean strike. Henry VIII spared no coin for this. And so on a cold morning, Anne walked to her death, slender, graceful, her prayers on her lips. They say the blade fell so swiftly that her mouth was still moving when her head met the straw. I can still hear the poet Wyatt's mournful words penned from his own prison cell. "These bloody days have broken my heart." And then, 18 years later, came the 9 days' queen, poor young Lady Jane Grey. Barely 17 when they led her to the scaffold in 1554. I saw her that morning, her slight figure wrapped in a black gown. She carried a small prayer book bound in velvet, the last gift of a friend. Her final message to her father is still known. "In that you wish me to die, Father, you will meet with your time of punishment." And when her time came, they say the sweetness of her countenance surpassed all that a human being ever showed at the hour of death. Sir Thomas More. How could I forget him? July 6th, 1535. A scholar, a man of wit, who would not bow to Henry as head of the church. 14 months he spent within these walls, writing by candlelight, his words scratched onto scraps of smuggled paper. I have seen the small cell where he dwelled, stone fireplace, narrow space, and still I can almost hear his voice. They charged him a penny a day for food and fuel, though his family sent more. I recall his dry humor when his sentence was commuted from hanging to beheading. He quipped, "God forbid the king should use any more such mercy unto any of my friends." And so he met the axe with dignity, his last jest to the headsman. "See me safe up, good fellow, and for my coming down let me shift for myself." But no tale lingers more darkly than that of the lost princes, Edward V and young Richard of York. I remember the old stories, how they were last seen playing in the Tower Gardens in 1483. Then nothing. Gone as though the stones had swallowed them. Sir James Tyrrell, under torture, confessed to smothering them with pillows, burying their bodies beneath a staircase. And though bones were found long after, still the mystery remains. Some say their ghosts still walk the halls, two pale figures forever young, seeking justice that history may never give. Ah, but such is the tower. A place where kings have died, where queens have fallen, where innocence and guilt alike have vanished into the mists of time. I have stood here and watched it all, the great pageant of history written in blood and stone. Of all the grim tales whispered through these stones, none troubles my heart more than the fate of the two young princes. Many have asked me, many still do, if I know what became of them. And though I have walked these halls longer than most, though I have traced every step of their final days, the truth remains lost, tangled in shadow and silence. Edward V, barely 12, and his brother young Richard, Duke of York, no more than 9. I remember the summer of 1483 when they were brought to the tower. Oh, they were seen at first playing with a ball in the gardens, laughing as children do. But as the months passed, their appearances grew fewer, and then none at all. One day they were seen, and the next gone. It was Sir James Tyrrell, years later, who under torture confessed to their murder. Smothered with pillows, he claimed their small bodies hidden beneath a staircase. I have seen the old records. The Tudor chronicler Polydore Virgil wrote of their disappearance. They were seen nevermore. And then, in 1674, workmen digging deep in the White Tower unearthed 2 small skeletons. Charles II ordered them placed in a marble urn in Westminster Abbey, their rest guarded at last. One was said to measure near 4 feet 11, the height young Edward might have reached. And yet, is that the whole truth? Many believe even now that darker plots were at play, that others conspired, or that the confession itself was forced. I have stood long in the shadows of the bloody tower, where cold draughts stir even on still nights, and I have heard, as many have faint voices, the soft echo of laughter cut short. The guards speak of spectral figures in embroidered nightshirts, just as the boys wore. Aye, this tower keeps its secrets well, and the fate of Edward and Richard may yet be among the darkest of them all. Until the stones themselves speak, we can only wonder and mourn. When you have walked this tower as long as I have, you come to know that even in death, perhaps especially in death, rank and station still hold sway. For not all who met their end here died in the same place nor before the same eyes. There was a difference, one that mattered greatly to those condemned, between the public scaffold of Tower Hill and the more private space of Tower Green. Tower Hill stood proud outside the walls, a great timber platform raised 15 feet above the ground, built so the masses might see. On some days, I saw crowds gather in their thousands, 10,000 souls, packed tight, eager for the grim spectacle. I remember the bloody summer of 1450, when the followers of Jack Cade met their end there. The press of people was so great that more than a few were crushed to death beneath the weight of their neighbors. The scaffold itself, a grim fixture, was maintained at the city's expense. I have read the accounts, £4 a year, paid faithfully to keep it ready. There was always the need, for in those times Londoners came as eagerly to an execution as they would to a fair. But Tower Green, that was another thing entirely. A smaller space, more intimate and reserved for the highborn, those whose rank demanded a quieter death. Here the scaffold was temporary, erected as needed, and the witnesses few, no more than 200, even on the gravest of days. I have seen the sunlight fall across that green, and thought how the quiet there made each death all the more terrible. The Spanish ambassador once wrote of it, the privacy of the place made it all the more terrible, as if death itself were whispering rather than shouting. I remember the care given even to the block itself. Crafted from English oak by John Ripley, the tower's carpenter, £2 paid for each one made. I have seen ladies faint at the sight of it, Lady Rochford among them, who had to be revived with smelling salts before her execution could proceed. Even the surgeon was paid 33 shillings and fourpence, though his services were rarely needed. The headsman's blade did its work swiftly more often than not. And so it was public death for the common traitor, private death for those of noble birth. Yet in the end, the axe made no distinction, and the stones beneath Tower Hill and Tower Green alike have drunk deep of England's history. I have seen them all, the grand, the humble, the fearful, the defiant, and in that final hour all were equal beneath the blade. There are those who say the past is gone, that the dead rest easy, and history fades with time. But I tell you, within these walls time does not move as it does elsewhere. Here in the deep hours of night, beneath the weight of centuries, the past breathes, and I have seen its breath in the mists that gather after dark. They say this is the most haunted place in all of Britain, and after all I have witnessed, I do not doubt it. Since the tower first rose from stone in 1078, it has been a stage for sorrow and violence, ambition and betrayal, and such deeds do not fade quietly. I remember well the tale of Edmund Lenthal Swift, the guard who in 1817 saw a spectral bear within the Martin Tower. They say he died of shock 2 days later, his last words chilling. It was not a trick of the light, nor a fancy of the mind, but as real as the stones themselves. That event brought the first true investigation of the tower's ghosts, Sir Robert Smirke himself keeping a journal of 17 strange occurrences in the years that followed. But no spirit walks here more often than that of Anne Boleyn. Ah, Anne, her tragedy lingers strongest. In 1864, yeoman warder John Humphreys saw her headless yet walking proud, as if the loss of her crown could not bow her spirit. And I have heard the story of 1933 when Captain Leonard Whitmore beheld the entire procession, Anne, her ladies, the swordsman, crossing Tower Green at the very hour of her execution. I have stood in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula and felt the sudden cold, seen frost form on the stones in the height of July. And others have seen more lights, shadows, voices echoing in forgotten tongues. The mystery of the lost princes, Edward and Richard, brings its own hauntings. The guards speak of the boys clad in embroidered nightshirts glimpsed in the bloody tower. In 1953, 2 guards saw them within minutes of each other, their reports matching down to the smallest detail. In later years, a nun captured a strange image in the same tower, and the readings from that film, they say, matched the energy of a true paranormal event. And Lady Jane Grey, the 9 Days Queen, returns most often on the anniversary of her death. I have read the warder's special logbook. February 12th, year upon year, her shade has been seen, sometimes heard, in soft French prayer. In 1998, tourists caught a voice upon a recording, Psalm 51, spoken in French, matching the dialect of her time. The past speaks if one is willing to listen. Even Sir Walter Raleigh remains his old chamber, now called Walt's study by the guards. Many a time during learned gatherings, the scent of tobacco has drifted from his empty cell, or strange lights have flickered across the stones. I myself have heard faint but clear his final words echoing in the dawn. Strike, man, strike. And there are other stranger tales. In the Salt Tower where alchemist Henry Croft once languished, the scent of sulfur often hangs in the air, and glass seems to chime when no hand is near. In the old palace where the king's polar bear once roamed, the sound of claws against stone has been heard beneath the full moon. And most recently, oh yes, even now, the past presses close. In 2024, workers restoring the Queen's House spoke of a time slip, as though for minutes they had stepped into another age. They saw the corridors filled with Tudor furnishings, heard the cries of Catherine Howard as she fled her doom. Their report matched old records none of them could have known. I tell you this in the tower, the past is not merely remembered, it is lived, layer upon layer as pages in a book that refuse to stay turned. The ghosts walk here, and long may they linger, for this place was built not just of stone, but of memory. And so you have walked with me through these ancient stones, through the shadows and the splendor, through the blood and the whispers. The Tower of London, it is no mere monument of the past. It breathes still. It remembers. I have seen kings kneel here. I have heard queens pray their last. I have watched traitors beg and innocents weep. And when the ravens settle in their roosts and the last footsteps fade from the courtyard, I tell you the tower wakes. For in this place time itself holds its breath. Some say the tower is a gateway to death. Perhaps it was. Yet now more than that, it is a memory made stone, a place where voices of the past still speak if one dares to listen. And for all the sorrow that has soaked its ground, for all the legends that linger in its air, I believe there is honor too in remembering. You have walked beside me tonight, through the secrets and shadows of this old fortress. And now, as I bid you farewell, I ask you only, this remember that history's voice is never truly silent, nor are the echoes that remain. Until we meet again, may the stories of the past inspire us all.